Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the 6th year of OHBM Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Bannattini, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. John Allen, a distinguished professor of psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience at the University of Arizona. He received his PhD in 1991 from the University of Minnesota with specialization in psychophysiology and biological measurement. He joined the faculty at the University of Arizona in 1992, where he established himself as a leading figure in psychophysiology, mood and anxiety disorders, and in the integration of neuroimaging with physiological measures. His research spans the etiology and treatment of depression, the identification of neural risk factors using EEG and fMRI, and the development of novel interventions based on neurobiological underpinnings of emotional disorders. Dr. Allen's early work on frontal EEG alpha frequency asymmetry established a biomarker for emotional processing and depression risk. Allen has also pioneered methods for integrating fMRI with psychophysiological measurements, including autonomic nervous system measures, to provide understanding of the brain-body interactions in emotional processing. His current research investigates novel treatments for mood and anxiety disorders, including transcranial ultrasound, EEG biofeedback, and transcranial direct current and alternating current stimulation. In this conversation, I discuss John's journey into psychology and his focus on mood and anxiety disorders, particularly EEG asymmetry as an indicator of depression. The conversation explores the relationship between frontal asymmetry and depression, emphasizing the need for transdiagnostic approaches to mental health. John Allen discusses the potential of neuromodulation techniques, including Psilocybin and focused ultrasound in treating depression. In this conversation, we explore the intersection of neuroscience physiology, psychology, and technology in mental health treatment. We discuss the impact of environmental factors on addiction, the integration of ultrasound and psilocybin in therapy, and the challenges of translating research into clinical practice. The conversation also highlights the potential of AI in mental health assessment and the importance of a multidisciplinary approach in neuropsychology. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did, and I learned a lot. Okay, today I'm actually with John Allen, who's a psychologist at the University of Arizona. He's been there for a number of years. As you heard in the introduction, we'll talk all about the work that he's been doing. I've known John a little bit over the years. I've visited the University of Arizona a little bit, and I really enjoy talking with him and what he's doing in terms of novel assessment of psychiatric disorders and also novel treatments is I thought was really interesting and relevant to the community as far as the brain imaging community and the neuromodulation community. So, and I think what hopefully we'll touch on in the conversation, just some of the techniques and some of the obstacles to actually implementing it clinically and then some of the opportunities for clinical use. And maybe we'll step back and talk about the general landscape of treating psychiatric disorders. I'm in the National Institute of Mental Health and, we're all trying our thing. And sometimes it seems like the progress is slow. And we're always interested in sort of new avenues and understanding new treatments. So welcome.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
So just to start out, I always like to start out with a little bit of a history of how you started, what caused you to be interested in neuropsychology to begin with. You went to as an undergraduate, you went to the University of Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm familiar with the university, and also you went to then the University of Minnesota, where you got your PhD in 1992. Right. So what first interested you as far as that was concerned?
So I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was, in some respects, a typical undergraduate student, taking 7 years off and on to get through. So after my first year, I took a bit of time off because I just didn't know what I really wanted to do. And I was working as a manager at McDonald's and mixing sound for local bands. And neither of those seemed like very promising career paths. And so I decided to take a course in psychology. So I'd already had a year under my belt. The course that worked with my work schedule was offered by Steve Sumi, who also worked at NIH for many years, primate researcher. And he was teaching Intro to Psychology at 5 p.m. a couple times a week. And I showed up in his class and I was hooked. Even back then, that would have been about 1983, before people were really talking about a biopsychosocial model. He was living and breathing a biopsychosocial model. He was interested in primate interactions, but also the neurobiology, and was just a fantastic teacher. And so that got me thinking, well, this looks like a pretty promising career path. And I needed to save up a little money, get back to college. And as I did at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I was also very fortunate to have a few influential mentors that moved me in the direction I'm in. I worked with the Chapmans, Lauren and Jean Chapman, whose work was on a risk for schizophrenia, a kind of a high risk approach. They were not neuroscientists, they were behavioral scientists, but they had just at the University of Wisconsin-Madison hired a new assistant professor, a very exciting person, Richard Davidson. And Richie Davidson came there as I was finishing up my time as an undergraduate, and I petitioned to get into his psychophysiology class, which was terribly popular. It was a graduate course. And I have to think that my mentor, Lauren Chapman, had something to do with my being able to take it. And so I took this course with Richie Davidson, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting, because psychophysiology is positioned in a way that lets us understand the neurobiology, the psychology, and how it interacts with our environment in some very interesting ways. And I just stayed on that path.
Okay. And so yeah, that's interesting. I know Richie Davidson as well. It seems like everyone kind of has run across Richie Davidson, and
Yes.
he's always pushing the edge as far as what he's doing. And actually, that says something for like really strong sort of examples of sort of someone that excites people.
Yes.
And for anyone who's a teacher, I mean, it's like you're influencing people, and you might be changing the trajectory of their lives in some sense. So all it takes is one
Yeah.
good teacher sometimes. So then you went on to University of Minnesota. So basically, a neuropsychology PhD is, as I'm still learning these things. It's actually very different. It's not totally different than a regular PhD, but it's sort of like it's a clinically focused sort of PhD where you're working
Right.
with patients.
Right. And typically students in clinical programs take about an extra year or so over the students who are in like a CNS program or a social program.
Okay.
We do clinical work, both assessment and intervention, and then we have a 1-year internship as well.
Okay. Yeah. So, and also I'm finding too that I have a few people in my group that are applying to neuropsychology programs. It seems really hard to get into neuropsychology programs. I mean, it's a really competitive area as far as that's concerned
It
too.
is. It's very competitive. Yes. In our department last year, I think we had about 320 applications, and 270 of them came to our clinical program, and 70 of those came to me. So it's and I can
Wow.
admit one person. So the math alone tells you
Gosh.
it's a tough pathway.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. That's really, yeah, it's different than a standard PhD program. So,
Uh-huh.
okay. And then you joined University of Arizona in 1992 and have been there ever since. And how is the environment there? Yeah.
Well, I think the things that attracted me here in the beginning are still true. It was a very collaborative and collegial environment, both within the department and across departments. So compared to other universities, I think collaboration is really not just valued, but encouraged here. We've had a long history of cluster hires. We've had institutes like the Bio5 Institute. I have colleagues in many different departments, both in the College of Science, College of Medicine, College of Social Behavioral Sciences. So academically, it's a place where we have always had a collaborative and collegial environment. And that was true in 1992 when I took my very first job, and it's true today. And so
Yeah.
when I saw the University of Arizona, both for what the university offered and also the Tucson and the geography here, it seemed to me that if I were fortunate enough to get tenure, this would be a place where I could see myself staying. I mean, there were some universities that were very good universities, but small, Midwestern land grant universities where, as good as they are, I just didn't want to see myself staying there for the rest of my career. So this had the opportunity to stay here, and it didn't disappoint. I stayed here the whole time.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, the Arizona sort of lifestyle is a little bit different than the upper Midwest in some regards.
Yeah.
And right now, it's better. It's freezing up here now, but also the culture is also unique as well. I found
Yes.
when I went down there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might as well talk a little bit about Bio5 because actually I just visited a few months ago and I was really
Hmm.
impressed with the combination of resources in terms of scanners and this sort of this center that really fosters, like you said, collaboration and
Hmm.
it fosters people to sort of use the resources and work together. And do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that uh, as far as
Yeah.
this is
So
concerned?
I'm not centrally involved in the administration of it, but I am one of the members of Bio5, and it's been
Yeah,
a really great resource here. Specifically, we do MRI imaging, and we've had continual upgrades. We were fairly early in the process to have a dedicated research scanner. So, as you remember, I think in the early days of functional magnetic resonance imaging, what we learned was how the brain worked at night in sleep deprived people because we were sneaking into clinical scanners and trying to do the work.
yeah,
Having a dedicated research scanner is just such an asset. Um, we now have two 3T dedicated research scanners and a 0.5T dedicated research scanner here.
yeah.
They've also made available all kinds of peripherals that interface with those scanners. So, for example, I had put in a grant to do simultaneous EEG and MRI recording with a system that I had, and only later learned that that system had a critical defect in terms of lining up the timing with the
Ah,
scanner clock. And so there was a small drift and just could not remove the artifact. And so I went to Bio5 and I told them my sob story. I'd gotten an R21 to do this, and now I need to do it. And I couldn't do it with the equipment I had, and could apply for some funding. And we managed to get a brain vision system that interfaced beautifully with the Siemens Skyra scanner, and we're able to do the study. So just those kinds of
yeah.
things are, I think, not available at many institutions.
Yes. Yeah. And it's sort of like it operates in some sense like a core facility that sort of like you come to them and
Yes.
right, they figure out a solution to specific problems and tailor sequences and
Hmm.
adjust timings and things like that, which is really people don't really estimate how important that is, I think, when they first start thinking of going to a university and doing this sort of thing. So it takes a lot of resources. So one last
Exactly.
question. Yeah, one last question about the center and your research, and that is how much time do you spend practicing? How much time do you spend teaching and
Ah.
also doing research?
Yeah. Well, my job description on paper is 40-40-20, 40% research, 40% teaching, and 20% service. Um, at times, the service has gone up on paper to 30%. So it varies, but that's probably a reasonable estimate across the board. I teach both graduate and undergraduate courses. And over the course of the years, I've taught courses ranging from 4 people to 1,168 people. That was an intro psych course.
Wow, cool. So, okay. So now I'll get into the questions. So that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast is because I love digging into each individual, sort of what they do a little bit more deeply. It forces me to sort of keep up not only on the literature but on the people doing the research and the groups around the world. And so, I mean, you're basically your focus has been sort of the etiology and which is like the causes and treatment for mood and anxiety disorders. And also, you
Hmm.
want to identify risk factors. You've done a lot of work with EEG, and we'll get into talking about that, looking at EEG. And the key thing that I saw that was your main body of work for a long time was looking at this EEG asymmetry and
Hmm.
as an indicator of depression, which definitely want to get into talking about that. Also looking at resting state fMRI connectivity and also looking at cardiac vagal control, which is basically just heart rate variability. And there's probably more to it than that, but you even have a patent on a measurement of that. So maybe we'll just jump right into it.
Okay.
So yeah, tell us about your research, your body of research on looking at EEG asymmetry and what it means.
So, I mean, my interest in this was kindled by my exposure to Richie Davidson because that was one of the first measures that he spent a lot of time investigating. And so I took that up for myself as well. to understand why this might be interesting is at the time that he published his first paper, which was actually 1979, and then plenty of papers in the 80s, the primary tools of the neuroimagers were in psychophysiology, and we didn't have functional magnetic resonance imaging at the time. There were PET scans, there were SPECT scans, but those were pretty invasive. And so many of the questions at that time revolved around lateralization, not localization. In fact, there was a real shift once fMRI came in the 90s, moving from lateralization studied by EEG measures to histoscopic measures, behavioral lateralized presentation, and so on, to localization measures. So that measure comes out of that tradition. Also, being EEG, it doesn't have the same kind of localization precision, of course, that MRI does. So we're dealing with relatively large neuronal ensembles, and even with some uncertainty about if we're talking about frontal EEG asymmetry, if it's really coming from frontal regions. A lot of my work in this area was looking at methodological issues related to the recording of frontal EEG asymmetry, its reliability. One of the big issues that has been discussed for many years is the impact of the reference that's chosen. So anytime we record EEG, we're not recording activity at just a site, it's the difference between that site and the reference site. And what you choose for the reference completely changes what you see. And because EEG activity is volume conducted throughout the brain, you can have an electrode here in the frontal region and actually be picking up volume conducted activity from the occipital cortex. And so one of the solutions to this is to use something like a current source density Laplacian transformation to try to attenuate the impact of the distal sources. And then, while you can't say with certainty if you're recording over a frontal lead that you have frontal alpha, you're in much better standing saying we have attenuated those distal sources. So I spent some time looking at that. And it turns out that in the largest study to date, as far as I'm aware, 306 people, of whom about half of them have a history of depression. Really, it was the CSD montage that helped us to differentiate those with a history of depression from those with no history of depression. And that high risk paradigm logic is one where you look at not just currently depressed people, but previously depressed people, so that we can try to say, is this just a correlate of the state of depression, or is this somehow identifying a person who has had depression? And the inference we'd like to make is that this might be tapping risk. We know that people who have had an episode of depression, just a single episode, are at a 50% chance of getting a second episode. And by the time they've had 2 episodes, that rises to 75% chance. And by the time they've had 3 episodes, it's over a 90% chance. So it is a high risk sample. And it might tell us something about the neural circuitry that gives rise to risk for depression. We can't, of course, differentiate that from what people call the SCAR hypothesis, right? That once you've been depressed, even though you're now feeling well again, euthymic, there could be some residual reorganization for the so-called SCAR. And that, can't be entirely ruled out. But we did see that we were able to predict the future development of depression in some of our individuals who hadn't been depressed. And that's also been work done by another investigator, Robin Nusslick at Northwestern University. Okay. So that's what we see as EEG asymmetry. Looking at it further, the other thing that we looked at carefully was that a lot of this work has just been done in the resting state. And certainly there's a lot to be learned from the resting state. But in a paper with, at that time, a recent graduate student, Jim Cohen, who's now a professor at the University of Virginia, and Patrick McKnight, we wrote the paper that and devised what we called the capability model. And that is, if you really want to understand neural circuitry related to depression, then maybe you need to engage that circuitry in a way that might show that deficit. And so emotional challenges are probably going to be more fruitful in that regard. And so we've done several comparisons, and we see when we have these emotional challenges, the differences that we see at rest between people with depression or a history of depression and never depressed controls are amplified. They are larger when we see them in those task-related conditions. And this is not a task like event related over 1,000 milliseconds. This is task like over a minute of time.
Yeah. So, okay. All right. So let me just ask a question about that a little bit. So I think that right, your capability model sort of, just to me, it resonates with the idea that, driving a system in some way. And you wrote maybe we'll get into your book that you wrote. That was kind of the standard in the field of the idea that you have to sort of, one of the things in the book was that you have to drive the system to sort of bring out these effects. Right. As far as interpreting also, so it's a little bit more sensitive than just resting state, but as far as interpreting at a mechanistic level, what the asymmetry implies. So
Hmm.
you're measuring, from what I understand, alpha frequencies, and alpha frequencies are more suppressive of neural activity.
Hmm.
And so it seems like the left frontal alpha would suppress neural activity, and then somehow that's related to depression.
Right. Right. Yes.
So yeah,
Well, I think that the heart of your question is perhaps why some people might be skeptical of this work or walk away from it, is that it's empirically has demonstrated relationships with risk for depression, but really what we're tapping in terms of the neural circuitry and the mechanistic explanation is still underspecified.
yeah, okay,
Yeah. And that's both temporally and spatially. So if you think about this, we might record for 8 minutes and we're getting a measure of alpha across 8 minutes. And being EEG, we're getting a measure of alpha across hundreds of thousands of simultaneously activated neurons, frontal asymmetry and its potential relationship with depression. And one of the things that I think is a general point to make, and something I appreciate more and more, is that we have these silos of disorders. There's major depressive disorder, there's generalized anxiety disorder, there's obsessive compulsive disorder, and they have very specific criteria. We can diagnose them reliably using the DSM-5 and the SCID-5, but that might not be the right phenotype for relating to underlying neural mechanisms of risk. And so there are probably transdiagnostic risk factors that might be something that we could study. And I think it's true for frontal EEG asymmetry. It's probably true for default mode network hyperconnectivity, and maybe getting ahead of ourselves now. But that's one of the things I'm interested in, is trying to more in an RDoc kind of way, focusing on a transdiagnostic target that might give rise to risk for a number of different disorders. And that's also, I think, realistic because of the comorbidity between these disorders, right? There may be some common risk
yeah,
pathways between them.
yeah. So how much does so I mean, so when you talk about transdiagnostics, so you're just looking for other types of clues
Mhm.
for helping to uh, make a diagnosis as far as that's concerned. How much is that? So is how much is that driven by trying to understand the mechanisms of this disorder versus just sort of a empirical seeing what helps predict as on a statistical basis? So
Right. I mean, I think there's a bit of both, and at different points in my career, I focused on different aspects of it. Early on with frontal EEG symmetry, especially given kind of the limited spatial specificity and temporal specificity that we had by lumping over several minutes, I was more interested in identifying people who might be at risk, with the idea that then maybe we could target preventative interventions for such individuals. And a lot of the people that we recorded in our studies were late adolescence, early adulthood. It's a time where, once kids hit puberty, the rates of depression jump substantially. So if we were to find such markers in individuals who had not yet been depressed, there would be potential interventions we could use to maybe help them to normalize their experience, accept their emotions, a little bit of CBT informed approaches to challenging their assumptions in ways that might be preventative. But it didn't mean that we were identifying the mechanism and targeting the mechanism in that case. My work
okay.
currently, which is focusing more on default mode network connectivity, is thinking more about something that we can target with neuromodulation. We can come to that perhaps in a bit.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Before we get to that though, I'm still so right. So there's all kinds of disorders. Let's focus on depression,
Hmm.
for instance. And it seems that this is sort of like the general public and maybe a lot of the neuroimagers think that okay, so we always think in terms of, and even Tom Insel when he was director of NIMH, and he's changed his view since then. It was interesting where he was very much on let's understand the circuitry and let's figure out how we can go in and change the circuitry because it's a circuitry problem.
Right.
And then it seems to imply a lack of faith, for instance, in sort of therapeutic, the idea that your prefrontal cortex can actually modulate the wiring itself
Hmm.
by somehow using strategies, either cognitive strategies or basic practices or things like that. So the idea here with therapy in general is that it can. I mean, there's evidence that that you can have substantial influence on well maybe just your behavior and your outlook on life by your prefrontal cortex can modulate the circuitry as well.
Right, right. It's a potentially self-modulating system if we allow it to be, and I think that's One of the things when I'm talking to more general audiences is that they think that because I'm looking at neural circuitry, then I must be interested in interventions that directly target neural circuitry. And of course, I am in terms of neuromodulation. But if we
Yeah.
just think about, we do all kinds of things that modulate our brain activity. We eat, we sleep, we exercise, we spend time in nature, we meditate, and all of these things, of course, are going to
Yep.
modulate our brain activity. We get into thinking loops, and those thinking loops can be productive or counterproductive, and we can target those loops on a psychological level, and they will have neural correlates.
Yes. So, and it's interesting though, because it seems that, I mean, so one of the question I had when I was reading your papers, thinking that, okay, so that seems like it's effective, and just to a certain degree, but is it simply, I mean, do you think if, let's say you could target like subcortical structures or the other
Mhm.
structures that sort of lead to this behavior, still people have the faith that, or the idea that's what's actually causing the disorder. And so the prefrontal control is doing its best to manage that circuitry, or
Mhm.
even, try to change it to some degree. What do you think of that? I mean, is that
Yeah.
that general idea?
Well, I think anytime you have a complex system, you have
Yeah.
multiple doors in which to enter that system and ways to intervene. With respect to depression as an example, and I'm particularly thinking about the kind of depression that probably has some rumination, some comorbid anxiety, if maybe diagnosable like GAD, or maybe just, substantial anxiety, is that it may actually be what our prefrontal cortex is doing that's creating and sustaining the problem. I mean, it's not to say that there's no lower structures, right? Maybe there's inadequate interoceptive input coming up from the insula, but it could also be that the prefrontal cortex itself is keeping the individual in a state or in a circuit that is going to be counterproductive for their well-being.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's interesting. So why don't we just jump into talking about, I mean, the thing that piqued my interest last time I was visiting
mhm.
is your interventions. So both neuromodulatory and, I mean, that's another question I had, whether psilocybin is
Yeah.
considered a drug, or is it like a part of it, sort of a therapy in some sense?
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Well, so that's an
So
interesting
what did,
question. So
yeah,
I'll just to put it in the broad context. We're doing two lines of work right now that are very focused on neuromodulation. One of them quite directly using transcranial focused ultrasound for depression, targeting the fault mode network, and the other in collaboration with Dr. Francisco Moreno over in the Department of Psychiatry to look at psilocybin as a treatment for OCD. I think my view would be that, psilocybin alone is insufficient. In fact, I'd like to say if psilocybin alone were sufficient, there would be plenty of very healthy recreational pharmaceutical abusers, right? It has to be understood within the context. And there's a lot of discussion in this field about the mental set that people have going in and the setting in which it's taken and the importance of integration following. In some cases, that takes the form of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And in other cases, it's more just a supportive environment to help people explore what might be going on. But would see psilocybin in that sense. It is a drug, but it's actually a fairly short lived drug, a few hours, but it's a catalyst. It creates a moment of opportunity and it is disruptive. The imaging work of people like Robin Carhart Harris has shown that you get much more network crosstalk when people are under the influence of psychedelics than when they are not. And so there's a reorganization possible, but many things with humans, if left to our own devices, we return to a state that is familiar and well worn. So I think with the
yeah,
psilocybin, it has to be thought about in that context of we're providing an opportunity for reorganization, but we provide it in a setting where they feel safe to explore alternative ways. And then the integration can help them afterwards potentially move a little bit away from that previous attractor towards what we hope might be a new attractor. And in our work
yes,
with psilocybin for OCD, OCD is of course a rather treatment refractory condition. It's fairly most people do not respond that well to existing treatments. We decided we would give them at least 4, if not 8 doses, high doses of psilocybin. So weekly they came in and we had 15 people, and 5 of those people had 8 consecutive high doses of psilocybin. Another group had 4 low doses and 4 high, and another group of 5 people had lorazepam for 4 weeks, and then high dose of psilocybin. And what we found was a very good response rate. We had a response rate using the most liberal criteria of a 25% reduction of 80%. Standard criteria of 35% reduction, we had a 73% response rate, and we had a remission rate of 40%. And this was in a treatment refractory sample. What's also
Oh,
interesting is that
wow.
the cumulative number of doses that people had scaled with their symptom improvement. So the more doses, the more improvement. Because there were
Yeah.
those built into the study was a range of doses, anywhere from 4 doses to 8 doses.
Okay. All right. So do you want to explain maybe a little bit? I know that we're still, the world is still trying to figure out, researchers are trying to figure out the mechanism by which psilocybin does this. And
Yes.
that's maybe
Mm-hmm.
another topic, another question. And it would be interesting to see how one could induce, whatever it does. I mean, we have researchers here, Carlos Zarate, who studies ketamine.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe somewhat similar, but yeah, that's actually encouraging, definitely,
Mm-hmm.
as far as that's concerned. And like you said, with the set and setting, that influences how the brain then, it seems like it's almost like it becomes sort of a blank, not really a blank slate, but sort of all the grooves are sort of loosened. And
Yeah.
then that's an opportunity to go in and change
Mm-hmm.
the standard processing. So what about your focused ultrasound now for depression?
Sure. So this is also based upon the findings substantiated by meta-analysis that you do tend to see a default mode network hyperconductivity in individuals with depression compared to non-depressed controls. And you also see alterations in internetwork connectivity as well. And so we have targeted one of the hubs of the default mode network, the anterior medial prefrontal cortex. This was just an open label trial of 20 individuals. They were a complicated sample, so it wasn't one of the squeaky clean, only depression, nothing else kind of samples that much of the literature has. We had people with 85% of the sample had a comorbidity. I think close to half of them were on medication, but it was a stable dose, and obviously it wasn't working well because they were depressed. And we found that we got a 65% response rate, a response rate defined as a 50% reduction in symptom severity. And we had a 35% remission rate in this sample. And that we were able to decrease default mode network connectivity between our target, the anterior medial prefrontal cortex, and one of the other key hubs, the posterior cingulate cortex.
All right, just so I understand it correctly. So
Mm.
you're trying to target these hubs I mean, so how does focus ultrasound in terms of, does it only suppress or can it stimulate? I mean, how do you
Right.
arrive at, you had
Yeah.
very detailed parameters on your focus ultrasound. And I was actually really
Yeah.
curious when I saw that paper. I'm like, how do you arrive at this?
Well, yeah, the parameter space is huge. For those who are not familiar with it, focused ultrasound is actually pulsed focused ultrasound. So you have an ultrasound waveform itself, and for us, we chose 500 kilohertz, a half megahertz. You do find that with higher frequency ultrasound, like 2 megahertz or 8 megahertz, less energy passes through the skull. The skull is actually a big impediment to energy getting in. The skull protects the brain in many ways that evolution didn't even anticipate. It's just hard to get things in and out of there. And so by having the lower frequency, we have greater energy penetrating the skull and into the brain. It's pulsed at about 10 hertz, and that's just based on previous work that was done. There are models that suggest that higher frequency pulsing may be activating and lower may be inhibiting, but there's not really good evidence in humans anyway that we've actually done activation or promoting neural activity. We're mostly seen to be disrupting activity,
Yeah.
which I mean that's I think okay, given that some of the other approaches to like deep brain stimulation are also disruptive. And this is, of course, non-invasive, can also reach the deep targets. And that's the nice thing about ultrasound. With focused ultrasound, we could reach pretty deep targets with reasonably good spatial precision. And so we had a pulse repetition frequency that was close to 10 hertz and a low duty cycle. So it's just, it goes in and we have these 500 kilohertz waveforms coming at these intervals. And there's lots of speculation about what might be going on, altering membrane permeability, stable cavitations, opening calcium channels, maybe minor thermal effects, although we keep our energy levels below the FDA limits for imaging ultrasound, so we shouldn't have any appreciable heating. The mechanism still, I think, is up for debate, and we need more work on that. But we can see very clear correlates that when we target the anterior medial prefrontal cortex, we see decreases in default mode network connectivity.
Okay. And yeah, no, that which makes sense. You're hitting one of the nodes. Have you ever thought of, as far as just doing focused ultrasound on, like you said, depression is manifest by increased gamma or alpha frequencies, and left, or going back to the asymmetry.
Yeah.
Ever try doing like one side and, trying to balance out the
Yeah.
symmetry?
Well, yeah, our very first study with this, we went here at the temporal window because the temporal window is the thinnest place of the skull and the easiest to get energy in. That meant we were probably targeting, given our focal depth, the inferior frontal gyrus. Now, we actually chose the right side, which you might think, well, given the asymmetry literature, that's a strange choice. But empirically, in some pilot work, we just found that we didn't have any effects on the left side, surprisingly, and we found them in the right side. Now, that fits reasonably well with neuroimaging literature in that you can see the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and a little more inferior into the inferior frontal gyrus. That area is very important for emotion regulation, redirection of attention, and so on. So that seems to be not an unreasonable target. And we did see also when we targeted that, we see changes within the default mode network as a result of targeting. But I think targeting the default mode network directly has shown us larger impact within the default mode network in terms of decreasing connectivity. And also, compared to our first study with depression, we get much bigger effect sizes on the symptoms. But what we haven't done, and what I would like to do next, is to explore other hubs within the default mode network, like the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, for example.
Yeah. So the idea that the default mode network is sort of overactive, overconnected in depression. So it's the idea that self-referential thought, in some sense, is a little bit higher, is ramped up a little bit higher level. So you're sort of get into this mode of that could be depressing.
Yes,
depression.
and moreover, I think it's more difficult to shift out of that mode. So everybody can shift into that mode. And we probably do it when we have self-referential thoughts that are not necessarily depressing if we're not depressed people. But with the people with depression, they don't exit that mode and shift into a task positive mode or an external focus mode as easily.
Okay. So with any sort of neuromodulation, so you have focus ultrasound and even like psilocybin in a different way, you have this window where you modulate the network in some way, and or you open up the network to be modulated, or you modulate it directly. And then, one thought that people always have is like, how would just that one window, especially with focus ultrasound, like just doing this once or doing this a few times, how would they have long-term effects? Does the brain adapt and change that quickly?
Right. We didn't do just a one shot. So in our study, we had a 3-week protocol. We had daily for 5 days. And then in the 2 following weeks, we had 3 times a week. So it was a total of 11 sessions. Now, we don't have the control group. So, of course, there are a lot of non-specific effects. Depressed people are getting out of the house. They're coming in. They're meeting with people. They're reflecting on their mood. They're filling out questionnaires. And those things have been shown to be somewhat therapeutic in all kinds of intervention studies, but we think that our effect sizes are big enough to suggest we're certainly doing more than just that. But I think the idea that we're disrupting this network repeatedly across many days may be giving the individual a chance to, their subjective sense would be they start to see things a bit differently. They may be able to step out of that loop enough to maybe give them a little bit more flexibility in terms of not being stuck in that default mode state where the subjective effects would be self-focused, negative mentation, like rumination.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, it works. It's still trying to, I think, probably it's a long way to go to understand the precise mechanism by which this sort of either catches on or doesn't. I mean, one thing I found also curious is that it does seem to affect BDNF, serotonin, and whatnot. And so that's actually interesting as well, how this intervention affects that.
Yeah, we don't have any, indices to let us assess that in our study, but I think that's a very interesting question. And then pharmacological interventions are fairly brute force instruments because they're not delivered to just, a targeted system within the brain. They're delivered all over the brain and all over the body. So, there's serotonin receptors, quite a few of them in the gut, for example. And so when you give somebody an SSRI, probably targeting relevant systems and plenty of irrelevant systems as well. So the idea that you can be more precise in the modulation with something like transcranial focused ultrasound, I think is really appealing.
Yes. Have you used other techniques like TMS or TDCS or things like that?
I have not done TMS. We experimented a little bit with TDCS, but that has a lot of spatial non-specificity and also a big parameter space. And the effect sizes, as I saw them, didn't seem to be as large. TACS similarly. We didn't do much of that. Early, before all of these techniques, we did some EEG biofeedback, trying to change frontal EEG asymmetry. We were able to change emotional responsiveness in non-depressed people using that protocol. We gave a 5-day course of frontal EEG asymmetry, trying to move people either to greater left frontal alpha or greater right frontal alpha, and their subjective response to emotional film clips followed what you'd predict theoretically, that when you increase left frontal alpha, that is less left frontal activity, we would infer people do not show as much interest or amusement in the films as if you do the opposite. And we also saw changes in corrugator activity and zygomatic activity that corresponded with that as well. We did go on to try to do that in depression, and that was very difficult. People don't feel that they have control over EEG biofeedback. They feel kind of helpless. And mapping that onto a person with depression who may already have learned helplessness, they did not like this.
They just get more frustrated.
They did not like that treatment. Now, I think there's an engineering problem here that we probably could have had a more sophisticated biofeedback system, but this was in the late 90s and the technology was not that great. We just had high and low tones. You could maybe gamify it a bit and do something. I think that's still an open question.
Yeah. I mean, people have tried doing biofeedback with, so it's interesting. I mean, people have gravitated, fMRI is even harder because the signal is delayed by 7 seconds and it's not this immediate feedback, but they've sort of gone about trying to do covert feedback where they're trying to do some task and they get like a shot of dopamine, like the success, if it just randomly whenever, the appropriate response or connectivity happens. So I wonder if like designing a task like that, like a covert task.
Yes.
So all you're doing is like, you're trying to increase maybe dopamine or whatever, or reward whenever that just randomly happens to be lowered.
Yeah. I think people might be able to learn that. In our EEG biofeedback, we also had covert training that every time they blinked, the noise turned off, but we didn't tell them that was what was happening. And you could just see the blink rates went down rapidly. People quite quickly learned not to blink. Yeah. And they were not aware of it. It was very interesting.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that, who knows? I mean, that seems like there's a lot of potential there as far as that's concerned.
Can I return to one thing that we were talking about before? You were mentioning ketamine, we were talking about psilocybin. As I know the literature on ketamine, I haven't done any work with ketamine myself, is that for depression, it is helpful acutely and for relatively short duration, but the model is that you probably need to have some schedule of maintenance with that. With psilocybin, we followed our OCD patients out to 6 months, and we still had a very impressive response rate, even at 6 months. There were a couple of people who had substantial increases in symptoms again, but most people maintained their symptomatic improvement. And this makes me think, this was related to one of the questions you sent before we met today, is that, I don't see any of these as a one-time, one-shot cure, because I don't think we know what we're curing. We are modulating. And so when I teach courses on this to my students, I talk about, we all embrace a dental health model where you go in every 6 months, you get checked out, you get things tweaked, you get things cleaned, and then you go away. But you don't think you're done, right? You have to come back 6 months later. And I think we should think about a mental health model in much the same way, that, we go in for checkups or a dose of ketamine or a dose of psilocybin or a few doses of ultrasound. And also consistent with a dental health model, we have prescriptions in the meantime for healthy behaviors, right? In the dental health model, we know we should brush twice a day, we should floss regularly, right? And, with the mental health model, there are plenty of things we could prescribe as well to help people. So I think we have to think about it in that kind of holistic context.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think you're right. I think that getting out of that mindset of a cure and just one thing. Yeah, so that actually brings to mind a question that I've often had in terms of even the field of psychiatry relative to other medical fields or psychology and psychiatry. Relative to other fields, it seems that it's a common belief that none of these disorders are really curable. It's like a constant sort of struggle. I mean, you might manage it better with your life, but is it really cured? As in, like, if you have a broken bone, you can just set it, it heals. And so what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that, what do you think the most curable disorders are? Maybe it is depression, and what's the least curable? And then where do you think the long-term prospects on that would be?
Well, let's for a moment exclude personality disorders, since they're by definition such long-standing things. They're difficult to cure or to make substantial change with. And I think we have to think about, just statistically, people who've had an episode of depression are higher risk again. A cure, I don't think, is really the right nomenclature here, but there are also plenty of people who, after one episode or even, multiple episodes, then seem to be symptom free for decades.
Wow.
And, the anecdotes are interesting. I'm not aware of any, intensive large scale study to understand, what happens to these people who can just finally be free of the risk for these future episodes, and they spend years in euthymic state. Some of the anecdotes I've heard, it's no one thing, but it's a comprehensive lifestyle change. And it's not, as one psychologist said, it's not a depression prevention plan, it's a life improvement plan. Everything about their life changed: their interpersonal relationships, their physical health, their exercise, their diet. It was the whole package that seemed to change in these individuals. I think what we can offer with the kinds of interventions we've been talking about is the chance to disrupt the current loop, the current attractor state, open it up to a possibility of something new, and then with the right multimodal changes, diet, exercise, psychotherapy, meditation, friendships, all of these can help people get out of that stuckness.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, and that's actually kind of like an art of a psychologist. That what they try to do is sort of identify what are the bottlenecks in terms of that. If they're in a bad environment, a social environment, or whatever. I even read the study where they models of addiction with animal models, and they put them in a really rich social setting, and they no longer were addicted.
I saw that. That was fascinating. Right. They no longer self-administer by pressing the bar to get plastered the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it'd be interesting to sort of, have a kind of a meta model of this in some sense, and sort of understand like what these variables are and how to work with them in that regard in a little bit more formalized way as well. It seems like there's a lot of potential as far as that's concerned.
Definitely.
Yeah. So in terms of what you're doing, I mean, and I'm certainly this is all research. I mean, you're helping patients, but it's still in the context of, like you said, like either clinical trials or that. So what are the steps from getting, let's say the efficacy of this, like you suggested, it seems like it should pass a clinical trial sort of standards. And what's next? I mean, how does something like this turn into a clinical practice?
Right. So let's talk about both ultrasound and psilocybin in turn, because I think there's different issues for each of them. So let's say that we have a decent size RCT, and it really does look like the ultrasound is showing some efficacy. Going back to what we said before, is I think it creates a window of opportunity. So I would love to see this be integrated potentially with people in psychotherapy. And so if you think about somebody in a prototypically hyperconnected default mode network state goes into therapy. And in CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, is all about challenging the default assumptions, trying to identify plausible alternatives, and trying to see things in a more balanced way as opposed to a strictly negative way, and then implement the behaviors based upon that. But if you're in this hyperconnected default mode network state, it's quite easy to be focused on your own thoughts, dismissing already as implausible or not promising the suggestions of the therapist. And so could you, by delivering a transcranial focused ultrasound of the default mode network prior to a therapy session, break people a little bit free from that negative loop in a way that they can engage with the challenges of the therapist more effectively? And there are some commercial systems coming available that are, I think, at least in an affordable range for a clinic to have. The company I worked with, which was Open Water, now has an open source solution that sells for about $10,000, which people don't have that in their back pocket, but a clinic could potentially afford that, and could be delivered by technicians who are appropriately trained with the safeguards in place, so that prior to each session, somebody gets an ultrasound and then they have a session. And could you accelerate the rate of change? Could you also create more enduring change? I mean, these would be open questions, but that would be, I think, the next a translational aspect to it.
Yeah.
I don't see psilocybin or ultrasound as just a monotherapy devoid of the context, as we discussed earlier. I think it has to be embedded in that context. And I think that could also work for people. And CBT also is one of these interventions that is transdiagnostic. It works well for people with depression. It works well for people with anxiety. It works well for people with insomnia. So, it could be facilitated potentially by something like transcranial focused ultrasound targeting the default mode network to disrupt it. In terms of the psilocybin, I think we have to for a moment set aside the licensing issues or the legal
Yep.
issues, right? That it's tolerated in Oregon and in Denver. But in most of the rest of the country, you could get in serious trouble if you're trying to provide these services. And still technically at the federal level, it is a Schedule 1 substance. And so if the feds decided they wanted to crack down on Oregon, I suppose that they could. But the other issue, in addition to the legal issue, is it's a commitment to have a session day. So like
Yeah.
in our study, people arrived at 7 a.m. We did a quick safety assessment, some blood work, a symptom assessment. By 7:30 or 7:45, they're taking the drug. They're having their active experience probably at least through 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And we keep them there until at least 4 or 4:30 to ensure that they're safe to go. And then we have to release them to a responsible party. We don't want them driving that night. And that's just one session. You think about doing that repeatedly. Not everybody has the resources financially or in terms of their job being able to take off, and in terms of the
Yeah.
family support to come and help them to do that. So we'd have to think a little more creatively. If legal issues allowed it, could we think about a retreat format? Or could there be other psychedelic compounds that might be shorter acting that could still show the potential efficacies? And there are some companies working on this issue, for example,
Hmm.
synthetic compounds that have a shorter half-life. That might be a potential.
Interesting. Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, that's interesting. So it's in terms of just being implemented. Once it passes clinical trials sort of standards, then it seems like the process is just simply having companies jump in and try to sort of build the therapies and sort of
Yeah,
optimize how it can actually be used. And so then it's
right,
open.
right.
Yeah.
So like, I think, an academic partnership with a company where we said, okay, let's go into a training clinic even where, we know that the therapy being delivered is, up to a certain level of standard, it's manualized, everybody gets that same treatment. Could we do an RCT with a placebo ultrasound and active ultrasound and check this out? And if that worked, then, the company has an investment to say, now we can start selling this device to, clinics, for example.
Yeah. Yes.
And
Okay.
it could also be the case that it wouldn't actually have to add that much to the cost of intervention because we have to think about insurance companies, but you can have a technician do this safely
Yeah.
because the systems have localization. They will not work if the device is not placed correctly. So, we know that we're delivering the proper amount of energy to the proper target. Perhaps the biggest limitation for getting ultrasound into the clinic is that at least now we're dependent on having a T1 structural MRI image in order to localize for each person. Now, we have done some of our earlier ultrasound work just looking at mood manipulation effects without an individual MRI, but doing the localization with the standard Montreal brain, the MNI brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think for large targets like the posterior cingulate cortex, that we need to empirically check this out, but I think that could be sufficient. But if you're looking for more precise neuromodulation, you're going to need to have the T1 image. And so then there's the cost of that and even the availability, right? In rural areas, it's very hard to get. So
Yeah.
so if we could find targets that work well without an individual's T1 image, then that would also be, I think, a big hurdle that we surmount in terms of translational work.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, there's certain targets that are more standardly located, and you don't really
Mhm.
have to be so accurate to actually get at them.
Right.
Yeah, it's actually. I mean, that brings to mind another neuromodulatory device that I just am starting to hear about is near infrared,
Yes.
which is sort of like you just kind of bathe the brain, and so basically it upregulates the mitochondria and it sort of
Yeah.
somehow helps. It helps more neurologically, maybe in healing and things like that. But who knows? But yeah.
Yeah, and I think the empirical trials in that are lagging even behind ultrasound, which are lagging behind TMS, and so there's a lot of things to do, and it doesn't mean that there aren't commercial devices out there that you can get and try out already, but
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
Yeah, and that's actually interesting. It's kind of a grim, not really grim, but sort of in terms of, I mean, going back to imaging, it's like trying to come up with the right biomarkers, the right precision to actually help guide this neuromodulation. Everyone's thinking. I mean, my thought is that fMRI might be the best chance for clinical applications, is to sort of guide neuromodulation. But even
Mhm.
still, it seems really difficult to do and
Yes.
actually propagate broadly.
Yes. But along those lines,
Yeah.
in a study we did on trying to enhance meditative experience, we took naive meditators and gave them a 2-week structured meditation training protocol. And many people drop out of meditation because it's frustrating. They don't feel like they know what they're doing, and they have a difficult time with it. And we had 4 ultrasound sessions delivered there. And we did find evidence that we could enhance the acquisition of meditation doing so. But one of the things that we did with that was that when we were getting the T1, we also had a resting state scan. And at the time, we were thinking about it for research purposes. But then we realized, well, we can do an ICA and identify the very specific part, and this was a PCC-based intervention, the very specific location within the PCC that shows the maximum connectivity to the default mode network. And so we adjusted our target accordingly for each individual. We got good results. We don't have a comparison to just, hitting the canonical PCC target that you'd get with a standard ROI mask. But I think that's also a way to take this in a more precision medicine direction.
Yes. Yeah. And so that sort of leads me to another question. We're nearing up on time. But another question is, if you were able to have the perfect intervention for neuromodulation, and also, of course, high resolution imaging to guide it, would you be going for, like, for instance, the PCC, or what do you think are the most hopeful or potentially useful areas to stimulate?
Yeah. Well, my current thinking, and this is, of course, based on the fact that I work with these disorders that are characterized by repetitive negative thinking, like depression with rumination, a generalized anxiety disorder with worry, and obsessive compulsive disorder with obsessing, is targeting one of the hubs or more of the hubs of the default mode network. As I said, our clinical trial was the anterior medial prefrontal cortex, but with our meditation work, we got the posterior cingulate cortex. And based on anecdotal reports, it does seem that might be a more potent target than the anterior medial prefrontal cortex. So that's where, if I were betting, I would probably bet on that at this point. I'd love to have the ability, though, to target, several hubs within the default mode network, angular gyrus, the PCC, the precuneus, the anterior medial prefrontal cortex, even aspects of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that connect to it. Yeah, that would be interesting. And while it is possible to target multiple nodes at the same time, it's not trivial, because by targeting multiple nodes, you can also get standing waves that could then actually be deleterious to neural tissue. And we want to be very careful to avoid that.
Okay. Yes. I mean, when you talk about interventions, there's that extreme, and then you're just talking about meditation as far as that's concerned. I also find, like, for instance, exercise. I mean, exercise to me, aerobic exercise, for me, it's like night and day. Even still, I've been running for 40 years. And if I go for a run, my state is completely different than when I previously, but you can't really prescribe that. No company can make money off of that, but so it's sort of like, but it seems to me like an effective intervention as far as that's concerned. But and similarly with meditation.
Yeah. And also, to get to the point that you described, and for me, this is true as well, I think you have to engage in it enough that it isn't just onerous work, that you see the benefit, you get to that benefit.
Yes. I agree.
And that's why the compliance is low and the dropout is high with, it's easy to say, let's get exercise regimen in here. But the evidence on exercise interventions for depression is good, right? The effect size for those who complete is comparable to psychotherapy and to pharmacological interventions.
Yeah, which is interesting. It's sort of an interesting, social sort of conundrum as far as that's concerned. Yeah. So what other, so leading towards the end though, I'm I'm always curious about, like, referring back to Tom Insel. So he left the NIMH and he went into a company that sort of kind of works with apps on the phone to sort of assess disorders of some sort. I think it's either depression or other things like that. And also, and so it seems like there's a growing field of AI. I mean, it seems like obviously there is a growing field of AI in terms of all the cues. Instead of like having a psychologist sort of check off a questionnaire, it's sort of like you can recognize, facial recognition or facial expressions, word choice, cadence, and other biometric information to really hone in on your assessment, and maybe, in an iterative way, sort of guide treatment with that as well, in a way that's potentially better and more effective than what a psychologist can do. Is that, do you think that's true, or do you think that where do you think it will go?
Yeah, well, I certainly think there's a lot of potential for this to be a part of the entire treatment package. I mean, people are using large language models already as pseudotherapists. They're disclosing to them or talking to them. I saw an article recently that ChatGPT gets over 1 million discussions about suicide per week.
Oh, wow.
And, it's not trained to deal with that. In fact, they've had to adjust some of the things it does in light of, there was an individual that in short conversations, it was pretty good at leading people to resources and doing things. But in a longer conversation, there was this instance of a young man killing himself with the supposedly the encouragement of
Oh
an
my
AI.
gosh.
So
Yikes.
those are obviously things that have to be taken care of. But I think in the broader sense, psychologists pick up on certain channels of information, vocal tone, the actual words that are said, body posture, facial expressions, as you know. But it's also a lot to keep track of. And there are things that happen very quickly. Paul Ekman's work on microexpressions, for example, shows us that there are expressions that we're just blind to because they happen so
Yep.
quickly. And yet they do give us information about the internal state of the individual. So you could almost imagine like the Google goggles for psychotherapists, right? And they're getting all this
Yes.
information and putting it together. But there's another piece of this that's really interesting. People, when they talk to AIs, do anthropomorphize it. They see it. It behaves like it's conscious in many ways, right? Some of them might, at least in limited situations, pass the Turing test. People think they're dealing with
Yeah.
a conscious entity. And we know that connecting with other humans is really beneficial for our mental health. That's been the case before psychotherapy was invented, right? That people had communities, they had religious communities, they had support, they had extended families. People who have more friends do better. So if this is part of that, that's important. But you're dealing with something that isn't a person. And does that matter or does it not matter? Are we just willing to attribute consciousness to it and treat it like a friend? And is that enough? Or is it like in the movie Her, that once he learned that she was having these conversations with 8,000 other people at the same time, that really was demoralizing to him, right? It takes
Right.
away the specialness. There's an interesting paper that came out just a couple months ago called AI and the Future Zombie Apocalypse. It was written by Deanna Kaplan, Roman Politsky, and Chuck Raison, talking about just this, that people are interacting with the AIs as if they're sentient or conscious, and they're deriving benefit. So does it matter that there really isn't the consciousness there if we interact with it in a way that behaves like it has consciousness?
Yeah. In some ways, it almost seems like it's easier, like you were saying, because you feel like the AI is not judgmental. And
No,
I imagine that even if you go to a psychologist, you might, in the back of your head, even though they assure you they're not being judgmental, like a human being, we can't help that.
right. Right. And we are self-confirming hypothesis testers. So if I'm a bit depressed, I think people are being judgmental. If I see even, he's going to sneeze and he stops, that could be because, not because he had to sneeze, but because of something that I said, and maybe it reflects on me, right? So, but, if we take this back to the idea of creating windows of opportunity with interventions like ultrasound or psilocybin, could an AI be a part of the treatment package that then works in a scripted protocol or within a limited range, right, to offer like some CBT modules, for example, with the individual after we've disrupted the default mode network? I think something like that would be potentially interesting. And what I love about the idea of AI, if it really is done well and could show some benefit, is that we can implement this widely in regions that don't have good access to mental health care, rural areas, where the one psychologist in town is also the best friend of your other friend. And it's just,
Yeah.
or there isn't that
Yes.
psychologist. Telehealth has helped to a large degree, but AI could help even more. And there are people working on AI therapists, for example.
Yeah. I think it's I mean, to me, it just feels like a huge opportunity, a huge
Yeah,
business in some sense, not only business, but, for really, really helping people who don't have even access and maybe reducing costs or whatever. Yeah. And that seems like that's one of the biggest obstacles in general, not just helping people who have access, but creating more access to help more people.
definitely.
Yeah. So, okay. All right. Well, we covered a lot of ground. There's so much more ground that we
Yeah.
could have covered, but still, I think that people can have a good sense of what you're doing and the nature of, this field and the challenges and some of the really, really cool recent things that are going on. And I always like to end also with, I mean, if you had any advice for maybe somebody looking into either in a neuropsychology program or uh,
Mm-hmm.
considering neuropsychology, what would be your advice as far as, and maybe that want to do research, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
First, make sure you're ready. I mean, it's a marathon, and if you just run a marathon as an undergraduate, take yourself some time. Get a job in a lab, travel the world, do something. Make sure you're ready for this. Find something you're passionate about, because there will be lots of frustrations. We find unexpected answers and lack of confirmation of our hypotheses far more often than we find expected answers and confirmation of our hypotheses. So, expect that. Be resilient. I tell our first year graduate students that if everybody kept a failure CV, all the things we put in that got rejected, the failure CV would be at least 5 times larger than the CV that we promote out there on the web. So this is just part of what's to be expected. I think early on, as they're applying to programs, be open to novel techniques that they might not have heard of. Do a little bit of expansion at the beginning to see what is available to you in terms of techniques. There's so many imaging techniques, so many neuromodulation techniques, so many psychotherapeutic intervention techniques. Sample a bit before you then hone in and just study one thing, and be open to the new technologies that come down the pipeline. I mean, you and I were there at the time when fMRI was just coming online. But when I was in graduate school, there wasn't fMRI. We were just starting to use structural MRI in neurology clinics, and everyone's like, wow, you can see, we don't just have to infer that there might be a lesion. We can see that there's a lesion. And so there will be technologies for those of you coming into the field that we can't even envision yet. The idea that we could neuromodulate activity with precision deeply without, doing so invasively was hard to fathom even 10 years ago, and certainly at the beginning of my career. So it's an exciting time, and I think the technologies are only going to keep developing and developing. Also, don't do it alone. Be part of a multidisciplinary team. The kinds of work that we do require specialists in physics, biomedical engineering, psychology, neuropsychology, social psychology. We need to do these teams and work together.
Yeah, that's a great message. And that's good advice for anyone in sort of any aspect of this field. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you coming on. This was really a fun conversation.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you.
Neurosalience is brought to you by the Organisation for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode is produced by Zhuqian Michelle Lee.